I bet you can hear us now. Two streams the same day? No, sorry. One was a minute and 30 seconds of us messing up.
Yeah, the first one was a foul up. Hey, we're learning as we go, folks. You get what you pay for.
Everyone hop in. All right.
Welcome, everyone. We're sorry for the delay, a slight technical glitch.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully that allowed you to get some popcorn or lunch here in the United States or supper over in Europe.
Castle Danger, is that Montana? MN?
All right. Minnesota.
Minnesota? So I'm terrible.
MT is Montana.
Mm. Here you go, Joe.
We're going to give it a few more minutes, folks, as people are joining in. And we thought we'd take these opening moments just to once again thank you for tuning in. Our channel has grown incredibly over the past, just over a year or so is when we started this channel. The channel was begun as a pandemic project because we were bored out of our minds and things were shut down and we couldn't do reenactments as we often do. And really the genesis of all of this was I would often go over to Andy's house, joined by his good wife, and I would always offer color commentary to historical films that we inevitably ended up watching at his house. And what was your idea?
I said, why don't we just put a camera on you while we watch these? And here we are, from the original conception of the idea, 2 years later. Mm-hmm. I didn't even count at how many videos we've had now.
Probably about 50, I would guess.
I think it's more.
Yeah. Our first video was 1917.
Mm-hmm.
And that was beset with some technical problems as well.
It took me over a month to edit that video. And you can tell.
And then we lost half of it. Yep. And then we had to refilm it about a year later for the second half. And then YouTube cut out half of that second half.
I give up.
So we are learning. And hopefully our recent Saving Private Ryan episode is testament just to how far we've come, especially your technological skill and editing skills, which just get better and better with each video. And so hopefully you all see and appreciate the evolution of our channel as we go along, including this live video.
Yeah, we'll see how these go. These could be a new common thing that we do every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. And as we are waiting for more people to join us and as more people are falling in to join us for our live streaming, in the interim, I invite you to check out our website if you haven't done that already, and that is realhistoryfilms.com. You can find the link below in our description with a bunch of other links. But especially if you're an educator or if you know a teacher, we really encourage you to share our website because there's all sorts of wonderful resources to be found on there. Questions that go along with movie viewing, classroom discussions, primary sources that you can use for likewise classroom conversation that goes along with a variety of films that we've taken a look at or will take a look at. Here on Real History. So we really encourage you to do that. Share our website. If you know a teacher, if they're looking for good content to use in the classroom, we certainly encourage you to check out realhistoryfilms.com.
Yeah, it's a lot of work put into that.
Indeed. And there are some other websites as well. There's certain perks if you wish to become a Patreon supporter. That comes with various benefits depending upon your donor level. We have a Teespring website. If you'd like really nice, classy swag like we are wearing here, we have a multitude of different T-shirt designs.
Some really catchy, quippy, funny,
we try.
Yep.
We try.
And YouTube unlinked the Teespring store from our channel. It's still available through our website, but I have to go in there. It won't recognize it anymore. They used to pop up right underneath the video, but I don't know. But just so while we're still getting ready to go here, probably going to see me like this a lot during this, which might be a little annoying, but I'm going to be looking at the laptop here, looking at questions. Lots of, I love the Saving Private Ryan video. You weren't kidding about the length of it. I know you said you were from PA before. Can I ask what part? I'm in the Lehigh Valley, says Jackson.
We're in the Blair County area and right near the center of the state.
Yep. Right in the beautiful Appalachian Mountains. So, let's see.
Should we give it another 2 minutes and then go ahead and get started?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay.
2-minute warning.
If you don't have your snack, now's the time to go. Andy and I are munching on popcorn.
Is the munching annoying?
Yes, if the crunching of the popcorn is annoying on our mics, just let us know and we will desist.
Love the channel. Wishing you guys continued success. Demetrios, I remember being in the first 1,000 subs. I'm really happy.
Thank you.
And Dave, of course, he's been along for the ride.
Dave Mack is one of our favorites. Thanks for tuning in.
How are things going with your short film?
Yes. So my brother is directing a short film about our grandfather's experiences in the Hurtgen Forest during World War II.
He's the one that filmed the Fierce Valor trailer.
The Fierce Valor trailer that was uploaded on our channel. My brother made that, and he aspires to make this short film. And unfortunately, we started fundraising in February of 2020, so it was really poor timing on our part. And unfortunately, the pandemic just really put the kibosh on a lot of our fundraising efforts, but we haven't given up. If you or you know any millionaires out there who are looking to invest in a good project, it will air on this channel eventually. When it's done, it will be a partnership production with Real History, and it will be available to all of you. And so what we aspire to do with that project is to shed some light on a lesser-known campaign of the Second World War. And if you'd like to learn more about that, we do have a link to that on our Real History website. But you can also go to brushmountainmedia.com, and that is my brother's website. He himself is a documentarian and filmmaker and does commercials and other promotional things and as well. And we hope to have him as a guest host on the channel at some point.
Speaking of, he has done no small amount of research on the Hurtgen Forest. And so he will be joining for When Trumpets Fade before too long.
Yeah,
so.
Another good film on the Hurtgen Forest. One of the only films on the Hurtgen Forest.
All right.
So shall we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started here.
All right, folks. So what we're going to do
Shout out to Lock Haven.
All right, very good. What we're going to do as we are watching this, I'm going to let you know when we hit the play button. And maybe every 15 minutes or so, I will, give you a timestamp mark. And so if you join in a little bit late and you want to catch up on the film, you can, catch up with us accordingly. You can watch this digitally with your own copy. If you have a DVD or Blu-ray, you can do it that way. And at least for our viewers in the United States, Dunkirk is also currently on Netflix as well. And so there are a multitude of legal means in which you can watch this and tag along. So
I should have got a mirror to just hold up so they can see where we're at.
Yeah, I bet even YouTube would have caught that.
Oh, Winterfell gave us a super chat.
Oh,
hey,
thanks,
you guys
Winterfell.
rock, fellow Pennsylvanian history nerd.
Appreciate
keep
it.
up the good work and keep having fun.
Okay.
That's what we do.
So
thank you, Winterfell.
I'm going to go ahead and hit play right now. We're going to go ahead and starting. And the Warner Brothers logo should be coming up for you right now. I'm really excited about this. And I'll preface all this by saying, and we mentioned this on our little advertisement for this, but the script for this, if memory serves correctly, was only about 45 pages. And I think when you think about it cinematically, it's a lot like a silent film. Like I think of like big World War I epics like The Big Parade, and so it packs in a lot with relatively little that is said. And our opening scenes here show a cluster of German propaganda leaflets descending down upon Dunkirk. And we also have this prologue at the beginning about the enemy having driven back the Allies to the sea. That's the other interesting thing. The Germans are never specifically mentioned in this movie. They are always referred to as the enemy.
I never even noticed that.
And it keeps it very vague and even more mysterious when you think about it. You never actually see the enemy. They're always just a silhouette or a plane or some distant shadowy figures in the distance. And so they're playing on that, even in the way that they are described here at the outset. Something else that we noticed too is that, with these leaflets, I actually printed out a copy of one of the original leaflets. And you can find your own copy online if you really want to look at some of the finer details of it. But it looks a good bit different in contrast to the Technicolor version that we see here in the film.
And to make it stand out for those.
Yeah, exactly. But what it says, it's written in both French and English. And what it says, British soldiers, look at this map. It gives you your true situation. Your troops are entirely surrounded. Stop fighting. Put down your arms. And then we have a nice version here, somewhat similar to the one that we see in the film. But this is a copy of one of the actual propaganda leaflets that were being distributed by the Germans over Dunkirk. One of the other things I remember about seeing this in theater, I saw this on an IMAX, which is really absolutely the best way to see it. And that is customary for Christopher Nolan's films. See it on the biggest screen possible. It was so deafening loud. And I think that was by design to just offer this other immersive quality to it. But what I really enjoy in these opening scenes, I really enjoy seeing this urban combat. And we see the French infantry holding the line, which is exactly what they were doing. They were, in many cases, really forsaking themselves to allow the British Expeditionary Force to escape and have another day to live and to fight on. The one aspect, though, where I think Dunkirk as a film falls short, historically speaking, is that it's very sterile in regard to its surroundings. Now, as we see the beach scenes here and these guys lined up in queue, this is the real place, which, top notch to them for filming at the real place. It harkens back to movies like Gettysburg, 1993, filmed in the actual place. I love it when films actually do this. But the problem is, you can't destroy the active town and turn it into rubble. I think the town council would have something to say about that. But so much of Dunkirk was just completely leveled. It was just an endless pile of rubble and ruins. And you really don't get a sense of the devastation as a result of that. And so there's pros to filming in the real place, but there's also downsides to filming in the real place. I think to an extent it would have been better served if they had built a set, at least partially, and show our character running out of here.
It almost feels appropriate for me to raise my hand when questions come in. For
yes, go ahead.
Did they deliver the leaflets by air or artillery?
That's a good question. And I'm not actually sure of the answer to that.
You caught him.
You caught me right out of the gate. It was not uncommon for them to do either. It wouldn't surprise me if they did both at Dunkirk, because certainly the town was within artillery range, and that's why so much of it was decimated. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
The Hurricane or Spitfire flew for too long. I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Yeah, we'll get into that once the Spitfire emerges here. But one of the things that, visually speaking, where the film does well is that you have all these thousands of guys lined up, and Christopher Nolan, of course, is known for using practical effects over CGI. And
it pays off well.
Yeah, and I think in many regards it does, but I don't like these like 1950s looking apartments here in the background. So much of Dunkirk today is post-war, so many post-war structures because so much of it was destroyed during the conflict. The buildings just, they don't look the part in many cases in my mind. But what they actually did with some of these scenes, and here we have the mole being mentioned. And so there's 3 concurrent timelines here. One of them plays out over a week, one plays out over a day, and one plays out over an hour. But what Christopher Nolan actually did for some of these scenes is that they put cardboard cutouts of men in the far distance to actually take up the space.
Popcorn stuff in my
We see fires burning in the background here. We'll get into some more of that, but it doesn't take long for the enemy to appear here at the outset of the film.
You were saying that you didn't like the 50s buildings. They could have very easily like smoke screened them out.
Or put fake facades on some of them, or just spruce some of them up. But here we see the Stuka is flying in, and that distinctive screeching siren sound, that was known by some Allied soldiers as Jericho's trumpet. And this was done for purely psychological purposes on the parts of the German. And how it worked, a lot of people think, oh, that's the engine or that's the wind whirring through the propellers. It was sirens attached onto the plane. And as it was making these dives, the air would funnel through it. And that's what actually makes that screeching sound. So very effective in regard to psychological warfare, if not practical for any other purposes. But something else that I like, you see the British troops, they have their Lee Enfield rifles. They're seen shooting up at the sky, and there are black and white photographs showing exactly that. And I have no idea that they got that sort of visual cue from that as such. Do we have another question or comment that I don't know the answer to?
No, not yet. Winterfeld, when I was in 7th or 8th grade in Kennett Square, PA, I had to do a report on my choosing on a World War II conflict. He chose this one. You got a B.
I'm sure it was really good. I'm sure I'd enjoy reading it. So now, as we're about the 8.5 minute mark, we are introduced to our second plot line, and that is the sea, which takes place over the course of one day. And so we see members of the Royal Navy strolling the docks here with clipboards and ledger books. And more often than not, what was happening is that the Royal Navy was actually confiscating a lot of these ships. It wasn't necessarily civilian sailors going out and doing it themselves. But there are exceptions, which we will get into. And thereafter, we are introduced to our third plot line, the air, where we see a very, very, very small squadron of Spitfires. They would have been much more numerous than this, a much larger configuration of planes. And one of the great Easter eggs here, of course, is we hear this chatter over their radios. Some of you may or may not recognize one of the voices of Fortis leader. It is actually Michael Caine.
Mm-hmm. From
yes,
from the original
Battle of Britain.
That was it.
Yes,
I don't know why I couldn't think of the name.
Wonderful Guy Hamilton film. It came out, I believe, 1969 was the year. And as far as aerial sequences in World War II movies go, the Battle of Britain is bar none the absolute best. Have you ever seen that
I've
movie?
Seen parts of
it. We're gonna definitely watch it here.
That's why I'm better behind the camera.
A very young Michael Caine is a pilot in that movie, and it's like his ghost is coming back to life here in this film. And of course, Michael Caine, it shows up in most Christopher Nolan films as well. And so even though he's too old to play the role of a combatant, we still hear his voice, and he's still there. So I absolutely love it.
Nice little homage.
Oh, absolutely. It's a nice throwback to kind of the classic era of World War II films in the 1950s and the 1960s. Which leads me to another point, because there's another really good Dunkirk movie. It came out in 1958. That's worth checking out as well.
Oh, yeah. Somebody had actually asked if you'd seen that one before.
Yes.
And, you know, our channel gets a lot of questions. Have you seen this? Let me tell you, the answer is always yes.
Yes. And as we get to the 11-minute mark here, we see some tension unfolding at the mole about who can and cannot board one of the vessels. And we see French soldiers being held back. And to an extent, at least in the earliest days of the evacuation process, these sorts of heated encounters were in fact taking place. And I read some accounts where in certain circumstances, people were actually drawing weapons on each other, kind of hurling their bayonets at one another, and people kind of whacking at would-be passengers with the oars of rowboats and whatnot. But eventually it was determined by Winston Churchill, no less, that we're going to bring the French with us as well. And for every British soldier, we are going to have a French soldier as well. And we also see in the background here, as we're at about the 12:15 mark, we see an African soldier lingering in the background here too. There was a fairly substantial contingent of Commonwealth troops and French troops from Africa, as well as India. And that was one of the mild criticisms of this film, is that for the large part, these characters from Allied countries were omitted, kind of in the same way that other Allied troops were omitted from Saving Private Ryan. It's a solely American affair.
Yeah, where's all the Americans in this movie?
There was an American reporter or two.
Oh, okay.
Actually, but only one or two of them. But Dunkirk is such a huge staple moment, I think, of the history of the United Kingdom. That perhaps from a cinematic standpoint, it's understandable that they're the ones who get most of the limelight here in the film.
Did anyone land back there on D-Day for payback?
Oh yes. Really? Yeah, Sean Connery. If you watch the movie The Longest Day, one of my favorite lines in that movie. He said, "Mulligan's back." Let's get him back for Dunkirk. Was one of the lines in that movie. But I'll be introducing us to one of the composite characters in this film, who later on, 4 years later, almost exactly 4 years later, plays a really big role in the Normandy invasion. And so, short of the answer is yes, many of these Commonwealth regiments did return. If not the individuals, at least the units returned.
I mean, that's why they were saved, so that they could fight again.
And interestingly enough, when D-Day actually happened, a lot of people in Great Britain actually refer to the Normandy invasion as Dunkirk in reverse. So I thought that was a rather clever quip when you think about it. As we near the 15-minute mark, of course, one of the big things that this movie excels at is showing the pressure of it all. And all of this is heightened by Hans Zimmer's masterful musical score, which in my mind should have received the Academy Award for this year. And how Hans Zimmer was originally going to design this soundtrack is that it was going to be one continuous piece of music playing throughout. And that turned out to be logistically difficult, and they cut it up into a number of different songs. But just showing how all of these things are synchronous, all of these plot lines are interlocked, they were hoping to do the very same thing with the soundtrack. And there's kind of that staccato ticking sound throughout, adding to the pressure throughout as well. So
I forgot.
Really effective stuff.
Dave Mack actually says, I think they did fly in flights of 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
So slightly bigger. Yeah.
And how about the movie 303 Squadron? You don't hear much about that.
Oh, yeah.
The
It's been a
Polish-
long time since I've seen that movie. I need to revisit that one. I don't remember too much about it, but I need to revisit it for sure. Great suggestion. As we get into our first dogfight in the movie, when we think about distance and how time correlates with it, I think on average, as the ships were coming over the channel, I think on average it was about 45, 55 miles away, nautically speaking. And so planes could zip over that length fairly quickly. I believe, the Spitfire at maximum speed could go about 360 miles per hour. And so they could get over the channel quite quickly, which plays an interesting part in their fuel, because they're always looking at the fuel gauge, in the plane here. Would they have, run out of fuel that quickly? I don't know. I guess it depends how many dogfights they get into.
Finger 4. I'm not sure what that means. No.
I believe the hospital ship that we see here is actually a wartime vessel that was actually sunk itself in shallow waters during the war. And it was thereafter raised and has subsequently been used as a ferry boat and cruise line for the coastline of Norway. So the White Hospital ship is actually a survivor of the Second World War that has been repurposed, as was the case with so many vessels that served during this time period.
The Spitfire could reach 369 miles per hour.
All right, I was only 9 miles off. That's not too bad.
Finger 4. That's their flight formation.
Okay. And I believe around the 18-minute mark, we see a Junkers German plane flying over here. And shortly thereafter, we see the introduction of a very large naval vessel. And, here too, you can get into these semantics about CGI versus practical effects. The vessel that we see here is actually a French destroyer, and I believe it was actually commissioned in 1957, so it's about 2 decades off the mark, perhaps, of what it should look like. But how many audience members are actually going to know that? And it's still somewhat close.
86 of them now.
But when I saw it in theaters, I thought, that looks a bit off. That looks post-war. And there's something else that we really don't get a sense of is just there's thousands of ships and we never see that many. And I'm thinking, they could have multiplied, some of these real life ships and it wouldn't have looked hokey or fake or anything like that. And so, one of my fears is that when people watch this, the sense of scale of the real operation will be lost on them. I don't know.
We're getting pretty technical here. I think at Dunkirk, the RAF was in transition from Vic 3 to Finger 4.
Okay.
As a U.S. Navy veteran, I noticed.
Thank you for your technical expertise. You notice that Tom Hardy wears a lot of masks in his movies? You think of this movie or playing Bane and the Dark Knight movies? And as we get around the 20 minute, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, forget about
it. As we get near the 20-minute mark here, we see that Fortis leader has gone missing in the most recent dogfight. And the RAF, they lost about 150 planes in these various encounters with German troops. So we're going to revisit that a little bit later and get into some of the personal stories of those individuals as the movie progresses.
So they filmed this on the actual location. So that's the actual mole where this took place?
I believe they rebuilt the wooden portions over essentially what the foundations or memorial. I haven't been there myself. I'm not exactly sure what's left. But they rebuilt this mole to code. I don't think it's quite the length as the original one was, but it certainly looks the part. And so we are introduced now to Kenneth Branagh's character, who is an officer in the Royal Navy. And this is really the only moment that the audience has to get perspective on the big picture. What sorts of conversations are happening behind scenes. And I suppose it's worthwhile to preface what happens in the months before this as well. There was a time period, about an 8-month period, that was known as the Phony War, that witnessed very limited combat on the Western Front in Europe. But in early May 1940, of course, the Germans make their intentions very well known. They launched the invasion of several additional countries, France included. And that sets into motion this desperate, weeks-long campaign that leads up to this moment where the Allies are being pushed back to the sea. And so as we see Kenneth Branagh being introduced here, you get a brief glimpse of the strategic picture of what's going on. How are we going to do this is the big question that is on their minds. And
right there.
the earliest moments of the evacuation process were fraught with difficulty. They were only able to evacuate about 8,000 men the first day. And there's 400,000 of them there. And so it wasn't, the most prestigious start to it all, but every big thing has small beginnings, and I think Dunkirk certainly qualifies in that regard. But it was, like I said, what the movie excels at is just showing the tenseness of all of it.
So there's, I guess you're missing your Brody helmets for this movie. We actually were discussing that before setting up here. My
Brody helmet is actually on loan at a local museum right now. So it is behind glass, educating the public accordingly. But otherwise, I most definitely would have it for show and tell. But I do have other artifacts. So thank you for reminding me.
The main soldier goes through many harrowing moments trying to get off the beach. Is he a composite of many stories from several soldiers, or was there one guy who had that much difficulty?
All of the characters in this movie are composite characters. And so what Christopher Nolan was doing, and he wrote this movie as well as directed it, he, in my mind, read up very well on the situation of Dunkirk and took the best, the most dramatic, the most tense, the most harrowing of circumstances that were experienced by numerous individuals and condensed them into a much smaller number of individuals to make the story digestible. And where I give Christopher Nolan credit is that he was very honest about his intentions. He was not out to make a documentary. He was not out to make something that was pristinely, historically authentic. What he said he was trying to do was to offer an experience.
Makes sense.
And if he could capture the essence of the Dunkirk experience, then he could succeed in this mode of storytelling, which I think is something that is fair. And so I give him credit for his honesty, if nothing else. But I mentioned artifacts, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to show a copy of Life magazine here. And of course, we have Winston Churchill on the front cover. And this, of course, widely read American magazine.
Thanks, Night Feather.
And Churchill, of course, was made prime minister only about 2 weeks before all of this. And so 2 weeks into his tenure, he has to make this soul-crushing decision of how and when and through what means are we going to get these hundreds of thousands of people off the shores of France. And additionally, too, I think another soul-crushing decision that Churchill had to make that is often overlooked what resources do we and do we not send over there to help them out?
Yeah, because you stand to lose even more.
Because Churchill realized that after the fall of France, Hitler was going to be setting his sights on Great Britain. What proportion of your Spitfires and your aircraft are you going to commit to this ongoing battle in France when, to an extent, you already know that battle is lost?
Mm-hmm.
That is a soul-crushing decision that one has to make. So yeah, I don't envy him being in that moment. We're now about the 26-minute mark, and here once again we see the Stukas making their deathly descent, and this iconic shot of all of these hundreds of men gathered up on the mole. And it speaks to the desperation, and I think to an extent the hopelessness that a lot of these ground troops were feeling. One issue that came up, though, in one review of a historian that I read, to what extent was the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe, at Dunkirk? Did they have the ability to zero in on the mole so frequently like we see here in the movie? And so it was interesting to see some historians quibble about that, but certainly from a cinematic standpoint, it works. Any other questions or comments coming in?
More likely to run out of ammunition than fuel, the whole 9 yards.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe 303 Brit does come in 27 yards. Not the same battle, but the dogfight scenes always reminds me of Iron Maiden's Aces High. Okay. Kingman Civic, do you have a black screen? I hope everything's working well. Maybe try reloading. Oh, we got given the comparatively small number compared to the British troops of the Indian and Cypriot muleteers, unless you had a character who was a muleteer, don't know how you show they were there. I guess they just had people out there. I mean, you did see the one.
Yeah. And I think much like how in the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, if you had just made the landing craft operator British,
mm-hmm.
It's about acknowledgement. It's about representation, because a lot of these Indian troops really fought like hell. It could have been a wounded soldier from one of these countries who was awaiting evacuation. And it leads to another interesting point. I mentioned at the outset of the film, one of my favorite parts is the French infantry holding the line in the streets, getting a sense of that urban combat. Think about this as an alternative. What if they had made one of these three plot lines that of a French soldier rather than the British one that we see here? Because one of the big sticking points that I often hearken back to when considering World War II films, so many World War II films fail to give us the international perspective. This was a global war, and oftentimes we only get the perspective of one nationality when you have people of different nationalities interacting with one another to one extent or another. And so that's one of the big bits of grief that I often have about World War II films.
Let's see. The German airplane used in the dogfight was remote controlled. It was actually a scale model.
And that allowed them to crash it.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, that's another page from the Battle of Britain movie playbook that Christopher Nolan adopted for this film. Much of the planes that were crashed in the Battle of Britain movie were likewise scaled down remote control aircraft. So once again, practical effects.
Hal Baker, fun fact, any Commonwealth serviceman that lost his rifle or other personal weapon that he was responsible for was docked and pay for its cost.
What is it? with that sort of like, you think about like the Titanic and the families getting billed for the lost uniforms that their loved ones, were wearing. And there is a Titanic link to this story as well, which we'll be revisiting a little bit later on. So hang tight for that one.
Had Halifax become prime minister instead of Churchill, or if Chamberlain had remained, do you think we would have lost the army in Dunkirk?
Oh man, that's
speculative.
I mean, I love these sorts of hypothetical questions. And, and understandably, Chamberlain gets a lot of grief, but also during his tenure, his administration and his war ministry, as he was in office, this is when we start to see the buildup of the Spitfires. And so a big question is, could the British have attained victory in the Battle of Britain had it not been for that buildup of aircraft in the lead up to war? And so I think that's an interesting thing to take into consideration as well. But it's hard for me to determine what would have happened if Halifax or Chamberlain had been in power. A similar question I would often be asked when I worked at Gettysburg is, what would have happened if Stonewall Jackson had been there? And my answer was always, well, he would have smelled really bad because he was dead 2 months by then. Yeah, I mean, you can go any which way with hypotheticals, but I appreciate the question.
Was the Gary Oldman movie better at depicting Dunkirk than Dunkirk?
So I think you raised a really good question in saying that, because if there's actually 3 Dunkirk movies that come out within a year of each other. There's this one, Dunkirk. There's Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman. And then there's a lesser known one that's kind of a romantic comedy, Finest Hours. And so this one, Dunkirk, looks at the boots on the ground military perspective. The Gary Oldman one gives us the political war room perspective. And then Finest Hours gives us the home front and civilian perspective. And so all 3 of them are very valid points of view. And I think they work very well in conversation with one another. I mean, so I think it's hard for me to say which one does better because they offer completely different points of view as to the Dunkirk experience.
Tom Grimsley is pretty adamant that this is World War II Afghanistan. And
how so? I'm interested.
With just abandoning all the equipment and
oh, yes. That's a fascinating point of view. I had never thought of it in that sort of light. So when we see, we're about the 34-minute mark now, and we see Mark Rylance's character at work. And so as I said earlier, the majority of these small ships, these tiny craft, had been appropriated. They had been confiscated by the Royal Navy, and in most cases you had sailors in uniform who were operating these craft. But there were some smaller numbers in some circumstances where the civilian owners of the boats didn't want to let go of their craft. They're like, if you're taking my boat, I'm going on my boat. And so one such individual who I believe was the inspiration for Mark Rylance's character was none other than Charles Lightoller, who was the senior surviving crew member on the Titanic. And Lightoller he survived the Titanic. He served in World War I. And then here at the outset of World War II, he contributed his boat, the Sundowner, I believe it was called, to the effort. Now, Lightoller had a rather sad background because his son was actually killed in the skies over Europe in the first week of the war. And so he already had a sense of loss. And then the other big twist to his story is that he had a son who was a lieutenant on the shores of Dunkirk. And so theoretically, he was going to rescue his son. So it's an incredible story. And he took his son, one of his other sons, who's still a civilian, and a teenage crew member with him. And so that's what kind of gives us, this middle-aged old sailor with two teenage boys with him. That's kind of the root of where that story comes from. So hell of a story Charles Lightoller has. As we get to the 36-minute mark here, we find ourselves in yet another dogfight. And the Messerschmitt that we see here, I think all of the Messerschmitts in the film, they have the iconic yellow nose, at the front of the plane. That is a aesthetic characteristic that was not introduced onto German aircraft until after Dunkirk. But this was a creative decision on Christopher Nolan's part, because in his mind, that helped viewers distinguish the British fighters from the German fighters. And so I think it's something that's entirely forgivable. It's like giving the British Dragoons and the Patriot red jackets instead of green jackets.
Or giving Eugene Sledge a revolver instead of a 1911.
Yeah, oh yeah, all these little things, to help us distinguish one thing from another.
Regarding Lightoller, history sure does repeat itself.
Yeah, especially in his case.
This is awesome. I give it 5 stars, says Joe.
Thank you very much, Joe. We appreciate you tuning in.
Jared does make some mean popcorn.
I spent a mere minute and a half slaving over the microwave.
If it would stop getting stuck in my teeth.
It happens.
I always seem to have trouble comparing the two. What was the scale of the Dunkirk evacuation as compared to the similar, albeit by the sounds of it, far bloodier Dieppe fiasco?
Oh, boy. Yeah, Dieppe is a whole other thing. I don't remember the exact number of troops involved at Dieppe. I've actually been to Dieppe. It's a fascinating place. And as is the case with all battlegrounds, when you walk it yourself, you just get a whole new enriched perspective of it. Dieppe was more so of a commando raid.
As Dave just clarified.
Yes, hit fiercely with smaller numbers. This is an entire army at Dunkirk. And so the scale is very, very different in that regard. But when one goes to Dieppe,
this is the one scene that gives me
okay, I'll hold that thought.
Yeah,
go ahead and explain what's going on here.
Well, they just got
39-minute mark almost.
Just got hit by a torpedo, and the thought of being down in one of those ships in U-boat infested waters, locked in, just.
That's another aspect where I think this movie does really well, is that whether you're in the cockpit of the plane or down in the hull of the ship, you really get a sense of claustrophobia. And as you look at this vessel, this destroyer starting to sink, you can only ponder the absolute hopelessness and dread if you're caught below decks, because cases more often than not, the lighting goes out, the power dies off, you're in pitch black darkness, people swarming all around you. I can't think of anything more terrifying, as you alluded to just a moment ago. And what were we talking about before that? I said I was going to hold my thought, and I forgot it already.
You didn't hold on to it very well. Neither did I. He at several points in this movie nails why drowning terrifies me to my core. I completely agree. That's why I joined the Army instead of the Navy.
At the 40-minute mark here, the Hans Zimmer soundtrack that has this screeching mechanical sound to it just adds to the anxiety. A lot of the vessels that were sunk were actually the results of mines, because there were heavy concentrations of minefields, underwater minefields, that these vessels had to navigate. And then, of course, there were instances of torpedo strikes as well. But actually, the torpedoes and the mines claimed a lot more vessels than what the Luftwaffe did. So, yeah.
Oh, here's a couple. Favorite World War II film of all time?
Oh, man, that's a tough one.
We'll let that stew for
You
a
know,
while.
there's no, I'm going to be decisive
right.
and give one. You know, I would have to say, even though it's fairly bloodless, a movie that we're going to be examining this summer on Real History is Battleground from 1949. That looks at a platoon from the 101st Airborne at besieged Bastogne. And one reason why I like that movie so much is because I think it's the most authentic depiction of GI life during the Second World War.
I agree.
It's very honest. It's very candid. A lot of the actors themselves are veterans. And so, yeah, I think Battleground certainly ranks up there, and I'm really looking forward to exploring that one. Thanks for the question.
And Chuck Sneedington, are we going to get a video on Greyhound in the future?
Yes, we are. And I guess I can go ahead and announce who we're going to have a guest host for that one. Our guest host for Greyhound is actually a historian with the United States Navy, and that is my good friend, Tom Frezza. And so he will be joining us as a guest host for Greyhound, probably also this summer. And he absolutely loves that film because he's of the mind that finally that there was a naval film that gets it right. So yes, we will be looking at Greyhound as well.
And he really knows his stuff, so that's going to be a good one.
He really, really does.
We need a Real History happy hour.
Let's do it. Do it live.
Eventually. Oh, you go ahead, then I'll make my point.
Okay, hang on to that thought.
Yeah.
We're at about the 43-minute mark now. And one of the really cutting-edge aspects of how they filmed this is that they were able to rig up an aircraft, and they were able a two-seater aircraft, and they were able to make the rear seat look like the single seat in a Spitfire. And so you actually see Tom Hardy flying around in an aircraft, and he is able to see what the pilot in front of him is doing, and he is able to mimic the movements of the controls accordingly. And we just saw that his friend had to ditch into the sink here. We'll revisit that, but share your thought.
I know everyone's interested in questions like these, but like are you going to do this movie? When do you plan on doing this? The answer is we don't have a strict schedule. Sometimes we'll just be hanging out and we're like, ooh, let's do this one this week.
Yeah.
We do have a pretty lengthy Google Drive going, and it's probably 4 or 5 pages now.
Yeah.
But we list who should come on with us for certain things. And
yeah, we don't anticipate giving up on this anytime soon. And so if you recommend a movie, we add that on to an active list. And we have big blockbusters lined up, and we have humbler affairs as well. And I see Cillian Murphy here up on the screen, and a really good one that he's in is a movie called The Wind That Shakes the Barley that one of our viewers recommended. And so big or small, if you recommend it, we put it onto the list. Nothing is out of question.
Y Too Low says, do you think Nolan should have had more men on the beach to show how many men were stuck?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I think there should be more men. There should be more ships. There should be more debris. There should be more fires. That brings me back to the point that I forgot. There were refineries at Dunkirk, and man, oh man, they were going full blaze like you wouldn't believe.
Atonement did a really good job of showing.
Yes. We were going to bring that up as well. I think there's like a 5-minute segment of the romantic period drama Atonement, and that movie is also directed by the director of Darkest Hours, the Gary Oldman Churchill biopic. I think that movie, in its 5 minutes, offers kind of a more accurate depiction of the chaos of Dunkirk. Buildings were on fire. There was debris everywhere. Some troops were intoxicated, passed out, looting the buildings. They all thought they were going to die. Who can blame them to an extent? I'm going to get all liquored up and feel good, when the Grim Reaper comes knocking at the door. These were the things that were ongoing. And so Atonement, you can look up the clip on YouTube if you haven't seen the movie.
It's an excellent one-shotter.
Yes, and it's it appears as one continuous shot as well. Really cinematic gold when you think about it in that regard.
Now that Murphy's character knocked that kid out. I saw Dunkirk at my local planetarium. Did 75 millimeter film positively contribute to the historical feel of the show, or is it more gimmicky than helpful? You guys do you. Also do the Alamo.
Yes.
Was there another evacuation besides Dunkirk?
At this given moment or later in the war?
As far as...
there were Allied troops at Calais. There were troops at Boulogne nearby, up and down the coast. But Dunkirk was one of the really big concentration areas, and it was determined from this point that was going to be the main point of evacuation. Now, the movie, to an extent, as well as kind of within the popular historical record, Dunkirk is often presented as this very hasty, last-minute evacuation. But the truth of the matter is that in early May of 1940, the British High Command had a sense that the dominoes were going to fall in that direction. And so it was there's a little bit more pre-planning than what perhaps this movie or other movies would indicate. And something that the movie doesn't get into that Darkest Hours does is the planning behind all of it. It takes us to Churchill's war rooms, and it also takes us to Dover Castle, which is on the White Cliffs of Dover. And there is where Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay was really spearheading this initiative. And purportedly, this is how Operation Dynamo got its name. Now, it's been contested as to how it did get its name. In Darkest Hours, it shows a dynamo fan rolling around in the headquarters, and that's how they named it. But one of the old stories is that there was an electric generator dynamo that was located in the Dover Castle. And they thought, this is the nerve center. This is kind of the nucleus of energy and planning. So we're going to name it accordingly. That may be just a story, but that's one of the longer standing stories about how Operation Dynamo came about.
And not to mention a few... looks like Dave and Aaron and Hal, they all got together and helped answer that also. Thank you for helping out, team. Sometimes I talk too much and we pass up some of the questions. Sometimes. Are we ever going to do Vietnam War films that had the best soundtrack? Actually, we're very good friends with an actual Vietnam infantryman who actually also served in Iraq. Talk about a career. Mm-hmm. I think we hope to have him join us for We Were Soldiers. We Were Soldiers, that's right. At some point. Mm-hmm. We're at about the 50-minute mark now. And, here once again, there could be a lot more vehicles that would be trashed and parked on the beach. We'd see a lot more people trying to go on the boats. There's some really great artistic depictions of veterans who were at Dunkirk, and the beach just looks like an ant farm. And in these scenes, it doesn't look anything like an ant farm. The beach was crawling with hundreds of thousands of people. There's no way to
to get away from it.
It looks like Ocean City after the sand sweeper.
Yeah. And, we can see some of these cargo lifts in the background. Those did exist at the time of the war. I'm not sure if these ones are historically correct, though, period-wise. But as we near the 51-minute mark, we see this forlorn soldier who is deciding he's going to try to swim back home. And that may seem like over-the-top cinematic mush, when you think about it, but there are at least 3 or 4 accounts of eyewitnesses attesting to individuals doing that exact thing. People who had given up, people who were lost in delirium, who decided they were going to try to swim out to the ships. And of course, they just get consumed by the tides as a result. And so this idea of a guy throwing down his helmet and his rifle, it's not as far-fetched as one might think. But this beach, it was so consumed by smoke at times because of these burning refineries and all of the debris that some RAF pilots said that they couldn't even see the beach when they were flying over it. So thick were these, pursed plumes of smoke. So it was, it was apocalyptic looking. We really don't get a sense of that quite as much in these scenes. Like, 3 or 4 guys just mingling together.
Hunter Croft says, Jared, shut up and let me watch the movie. Just joking. Keep the knowledge coming, he says.
You can watch it solo anytime you want. Of course, we see Harry Styles debut here as well. I want to hear what our viewers think about Harry Styles being in this movie. Go ahead and make your comments below. Let the fun commence.
While you're all typing your opinions on Harry Styles, I'll let you know that I turned monetization on this video off so you can see it with no ads. I bit the bullet.
Well done.
If you are feeling generous and do appreciate the work that we do, though, you can leave a super chat or a sticker. I'm actually not sure how the stickers work, but those all go toward getting things like the excellent camera and software and things that you're watching this on now. I'm working on streamlining this live stuff here so that next time there will be a timestamp down in the corner that runs along so you can make sure we're always in the same spot.
In the meantime, we're doing it old school. Yep. Right now, we're at about the 53:20 mark. When we see the young man here who's had his head, unfortunately, bashed in, a little bit of trivia here, connective tissue with other World War II films. I forget the actor's name. I think it's Barry Keogh, I think is the actor's name.
Sounds right.
He is in the forthcoming Masters of the Air, the Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg miniseries about the 8th Air Force. And so I will be anxious to hear his American accent. Practically everybody in that series is British, though. So I'm really, really excited about that. We'll do an episode-by-episode breakdown of that once it commences.
Here we go. We got the definitive opinion of Harry Styles in here.
Let's hear it.
I won't lie. I think you did a fine job, says Nightfeather. Hal says Harry Styles did okay. Kingman Civic said, I didn't know he was in the movie. Dave Mack, Harry Styles is best when you have no idea who he is.
He doesn't sing either. So, maybe that's a plus for some people. I guess I'm kind of a cynic as to why he was chosen to be in this movie. I think it was some really apt marketing decisions on the filmmaker's part, because they're thinking, how can we get some teenage girls to come see this movie who otherwise won't come to see it? That's my thought.
Makes a good day. Let's go see Dunkirk. Harry Styles is in it.
Right. But let's give the benefit of the doubt here, because
he did do an alright job. I think.
He really does. And on top of that too, I remember when I was in high school, there were girls in my class who knew about Pearl Harbor because they went to see a Ben Affleck movie, and they knew what the USS Arizona was because of a Ben Affleck movie. Well, and they otherwise wouldn't have known. So we'll give the benefit of the doubt on these historical films for their ability to inform in many cases.
I was saying about putting a timestamp down there. Jerry says, I expect Jared to call the time like Red Barber calling the innings to create the World War II atmosphere.
We are now here at the 55:33 mark. We do the 1940s radio broadcast voice. That would get annoying after a while.
The transatlantic. Yeah.
So we're back with Kenneth Branagh right now, and he's kind of a composite of two different individuals who I've read about. And one of whom was actually killed during the Dunkirk evacuation. And I forget his name all of a sudden. It'll come back to me in a little moment.
We'll circle back around.
Yes, we shall. The other one, though, is named, one of the composite characters is William Tennant. And this is what circles us back to D-Day. William Tennant, man, he was all over the place too throughout the war. Had his ship sunk in Singapore, was involved in the chase of the battleship Bismarck, and then during the Normandy invasion, he oversaw the operation of the Mulberry Harbors in Arromanches in Normandy. And so here is a guy who did in fact return, to answer the question of one of our viewers a little bit earlier. So that's probably who he is based on.
And Ulysses, we did mention Atonement earlier.
Yeah, Atonement's a great film, a good period drama, even if it only focuses on the war for a little bit.
That's some solid advice, Charlie. I like that. Make sure to hit that like button. They gave up a good occasion to describe the French delusion frenzy towards capitulation. Were there any warships between Dunkirk and England to watch over the evacuation ships?
So that's one of the things. The Royal Navy didn't commit any like big battleships or anything like that to this endeavor because, firstly, they didn't want to compromise them amidst this really tense situation. What the vessels that you have participating, by and large, the vast majority of them comprise destroyers, minesweepers, cruisers, and cargo vessels. And we'll get into the myth of the little navy and the little ships a little bit later on. But the vast majority of the vessels were, in fact, military vessels. And that, too, is something that you really don't get a sense of in this movie. And there should be hundreds of them that you see in any one scene. And you only see one or two at most at a time here in the film. I think that's one of the big historical letdowns.
Diggles, we are currently at 58:53. We're 5 seconds away from the 59-minute mark. And there, you don't even need to answer anything. Dave's doing all your work for you.
Thanks, Dave. You're a good egg.
If including Harry Styles was to draw those who don't normally watch war films, it worked with my sister, who was only convinced to watch it by her boyfriend because he was in it.
There you go. And this movie did fantastically at the box office. I think it made about $600 million worldwide, which for a historical epic is a real rarity these days. Historical films don't generally do too well at the box office anymore, but Christopher Nolan is a brand unto himself, and we're really looking forward to his next film, which is Oppenheimer, which looks at the creation, the development, and the dropping of the atomic bomb. So another 1940s period piece that we suspect he will get really creative with.
If you want, I can put you in touch with one of the tech advisors from We Were Soldiers who actually was with Helmore during the battle.
That sounds great. You can email us at realhistory1944@gmail.com. You can find our email address in the caption of this video. And we always welcome connections, input, feedback, and all sorts of Keller commentary, either in our comments or via email.
Even if it's just a conversation that happens that brings up a good point in one of the videos that we make.
Absolutely.
That whole Barry Pepper Garand that all started as an email.
Yes. Have some more popcorn here. As we near the 1 hour, 1 minute mark, I haven't read of an account of troops hiding in a landlocked vessel like this or anything, but it adds to the suspense once again, and once more, it adds to that sense of claustrophobia. And I suspect, from a creative standpoint, that once again is the direction that Christopher Nolan was trying to go in. But we also, with this encounter with the civilian that they pulled down below decks, that's the other thing too, is that this movie is pretty much devoid of the French civilian perspective. Because, of course, you have thousands of citizens of Dunkirk who become homeless and refugees, and they're dodging bullets and bombs just like everybody else. And so, much like Saving Private Ryan, there aren't enough civilians in this because they became collateral damage. They were victims and heroes of the war as well. So I think that too is something unfortunate that is omitted.
What's your favorite Axis perspective movie?
I would say there's two of them. One of which is Downfall, the movie about the final days and the capitulation of the Third Reich in surrounded Berlin. I think it doesn't give you a sympathetic depiction of Adolf Hitler, but it humanizes him to an extent. It allows you to see beyond the monster and understand his delusional thinking in his final days. Additionally, too, I really enjoy Letters from Iwo Jima, which shows the Japanese perspective during that battle, a Clint Eastwood film. So those would be my two top picks for movies seen from the Axis perspective.
Oh, geez. Maybe by World War III, we'll finally get French people in a World War II movie.
Sad, somber thoughts there.
Valkyrie is good.
Yes, indeed. I have to say, it was worth the 1 hour, 4 minute mark. This part where they're huddling in the boat's probably my least favorite part of the movie. I just think it's slow. It's a bit trite. It's out of sync. And I understand they're trying to create a sense of intimacy in a claustrophobic space with some of the key protagonists, but it just doesn't. It floats as poorly as the boat that they're in here at this given moment. So that's my perspective. I'd like to hear your thoughts on all of that. What works and what does not work about this film? Some people thought that this movie was I'd say they're in the minority, but some people thought that this movie was a bit of a slow burn, that it perhaps didn't quite capture the intensity of the moment. I, though, from an artistic standpoint, really enjoy the crossover narratives showing how things are interlocked, even things that are interlocked that you can't see in your immediate environs. That's one of the things that I really like. The intensity of the dogfights, though, it's just stellar. I absolutely love it. It really captures the moment.
What are your thoughts on Generation War?
Generation War is a really interesting film. A lot of people have likened it to like the German Band of Brothers.
Condensed, yeah.
I think one of the downsides of Generation War is that everybody's fictional. They present them, there's a code at the end where they present them as being real individuals, but they aren't. What I think would be really fascinating in a similar sort of formula, imagine if they had gone the true Band of Brothers route from the German perspective, and you actually looked at a German unit in the war.
And at the end, it was the unit being given the speech by that general.
There you go. Universal crossover in that regard. But I think that's really interesting. I know there's a new series out for Das Boot, the 1980s German submarine film, which has been turned into a television series. I haven't seen that one yet, but I'm really intrigued by it.
Just for anyone just tuning in, we are at 106:30.
And the scenes bookending this, I think, that are equally frightful is shows the pilot trying to escape the flooding cockpit.
Again with the drowning.
Yes, once again. And I read from a technical standpoint in that scene is that the plane flooded a bit quicker than what they were anticipating, and the actor was actually in there kind of fighting for his life. Maybe they did it on purpose just to scare him a little bit and make him work a little bit harder to capture the essence of the scene. But it certainly works because time and time again throughout this movie, the idea of drowning, it is a repetitive one. And certainly it is one that was sadly experienced by many people who endured the horrors and uncertainty of Dunkirk. In more cases, often than not, people who were on vessels rather than aircraft.
I believe the new Das Boot series is English language equals possibly inferior to the original miniseries.
Yeah, I'm kind of a purist in that regard. When a movie shows French troops or German sailors, I like them to be speaking in their native language.
The Longest Day.
I think that's what makes The Longest Day such a unique film. And fun bit of trivia, there was also, all those actors had to film in both their native language and in English because there were some American versions of that film where everybody spoke English. Netflix had it on for a while, and the first time I saw it, I'm like, wait a minute, they're all speaking English. But while we're thinking about the Spitfires here, I was going through my library in preparation for this episode, and there's a really fascinating book by Alexander Seversky, and it's a Simon & Schuster book from 1942, which is entitled Victory Through Air Power. And so this is my original copy of this book, the incredible things you can find at used book sales. And so, this book came out a year and a half after the Dunkirk evacuation. And he actually has a chapter on Dunkirk in this book. And what he writes here, he says, photographs of the Dunkirk drama indicate clearly that the retreat was unavoidably improvised, as evidenced by the masses of humanity grouped haphazardly on the shorelines. These troop masses and the bevy of miscellaneous vessels in the shallow waters would have made perfect targets for the German planes. The evacuation, that is to say, would have been transformed into a shambles before it started, if the air above had not been effectively held and patrolled by the RAF. And this perspective is often at odds with the perspective that British ground troops had. And that's something that we get into nearer to the end of the film that we will revisit. Another point worth mentioning here that the author raises is that it was a very shallow decline from the beach going into the water. And that really prevented a lot of bigger vessels from coming in in being able to rescue these guys. But he concludes, and I think this is an important point from his perspective, the operation was made possible solely because a solid and impregnable roof of air dominance was established by the British and maintained during 4 epoch-making days. Under that shield, the action could proceed successfully despite its random character, despite the improvised transport service. A tactical victory had been won exclusively by aviation and was exploited below, on the surface of land and water. And so that's a really cool perspective from an American aviator from 1942. And I think it speaks to a lot of the really important elements of this film, historically speaking.
All right, Spartan 214 asks, what's one idea you hope people take from watching Dunkirk?
Wow, that is a fantastic question. You know, and this may sound a bit overly sentimental, but I can be sentimental at times, even though historians usually aren't. I think it speaks to the sense of unity. You know, we live in incredibly divisive times, but here in this moment, there was this existential crisis, and people had to rally behind in the name of survival. And whether, you know, big picture on the war as a whole or Dunkirk in particular, people had to come together. They had to work together. They had to bring these disparate elements, whether it be land, air, or sea. And they had to do it in the name of surviving to fight again another day. And so I think that's one of the big important takeaways from Dunkirk. And the notion or the theme of unity, teamwork, working together, it's something that's universally applicable regardless of what historical time period you look at, including the present. There's a lot that we can learn. You know, these weren't perfect people. You know, just because we often call them the greatest generation doesn't make them ideal in every sense. But there's a lot that we can learn from them still. That's one of my big points of view.
Have you thought about any Russian-made war movies? We're basically just ignoring Dunkirk at this point.
That's okay. That's all right. One that looked interesting was T-34, Russian tank film.
That was free on YouTube. It might still be, but I actually really enjoyed that. It kind of, you know, perpetuated the T-34 is the most awesome thing ever. And there's a channel called Laser Pig that has a really good video on the T-34.
And then there's the 1980s Soviet drama, almost horror movie, Come and See. Yeah. Which is probably one of the best anti-war movies ever made. But here comes a big moment in the film. We're at the 1 hour, 13 minute, 20 second mark, where we have Commander Bolton looking out onto the skyline. Inspirational music swells. And of course, what we see is that these British men, they can't get home, and so home comes to them, as the movie's tagline would suggest. And one of the absolutely fantastic things about this scene is about 15 of these vessels that we see depicted here in the film were actually used in the Dunkirk evacuations in 1940. And there's actually a Dunkirk Small Boat Association. And every few years they do, you know, commemorative voyages as such. This is a moment, you know, where like people get a little bit teary-eyed because it's very sentimental, and it reinforces that wartime idea of, you know, the civilians are coming to the rescue. You know, that sense of togetherness, unity of purpose. In actuality, though, I think that this scene is a little bit emotionally manipulative, because in reality, these small boats, which accounted for perhaps only about 5% of the total number of vessels that were arriving on scene, they were coming in and day out. It's not like, you know, they arrived all in one gallant rush like we see here. You know, what we see here as we near the 1 hour, 15 minute mark, I think it's akin to an old Western, like the cavalry arriving at the very last moment. But 5% may seem like a trivial small number, but even 5%, they evacuate tens of thousands of people with only 5%. And so even though the idea of the tiny ships is overblown in the mythos of the Second World War, for those guys that were on them, it was sure as hell important to them.
Yeah.
And that's something important for us to remember. A book that I'm currently reading that talks a little bit about how this myth is perpetuated. As you all know, I'm a huge fan of the channel Turner Classic Movies. And Turner Classic Movies also has a really substantial film library. And a really good one that I'll recommend is called Hollywood Victory. This is a brand new one, The Movies, Stars, and Stories of World War II. And one movie in particular that swayed public consciousness on the Dunkirk evacuation, perhaps more than any other, was a 1942 William Wyler film that was called Mrs. Miniver. And that looks at the trials and the tragedies of a British family, the patriarch of which is one of the participants in the Dunkirk evacuation, sails his small boat over across the channel. And it was that movie, which was actually released the same week as the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. That movie, perhaps more than anything else, reinforced this idea that it was almost exclusively these little ships that were coming to the rescue, where in fact they actually formed a really small minority. And what Winston Churchill said about the movie Mrs. Miniver, from a propaganda standpoint, he said Mrs. Miniver was worth a fleet of battleships because it rallied American audiences to be sympathetic with the plight of their new British allies. And it also showed the treachery and the villainy of their Nazi foes as well. So you can read about that and many other great stories from wartime Hollywood in the fantastic book Hollywood Victory, which I am reading right now.
Oh, I missed that. A Bridge Too Far has German and Dutch dialogue in it as
Indeed. Well. As we approach the 1 hour, 18-minute mark, we can also see improvisation and creativity. A war is often the mother of invention, especially in times of desperation. And we see trucks and vehicles being parked to make these makeshift piers for some of the boats that have shallower draft, which was done in actuality. And so things are getting really, really desperate here in circumstances as such.
Overlord 1944 says, God bless Charles Lightoller. I recall the movie The Beast about a Russian tank crew in Afghanistan being good, but I was a kid at the time.
I've heard of that one. That one's worth looking into.
Are there any important individuals missed that you believe should have been included in this movie?
Yeah, Sir Bertram Ramsay, who was pretty much the architect of all this. The reason we don't see him in the film is because he was on the other side of the channel in Dover at that time. But without Bertram Ramsay, Operation Dynamo does not happen in the manner that it does. He is an absolutely crucial figure in the whole planning and execution of all of this. But after all, there's only 3 concurrent storylines in here. That would have required a 4th, and it takes you away from the action. So perhaps in that regard, it's a little bit forgivable that he's missing. But he is an incredible individual. He was a member of SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, later on in the war. And he's absolutely fundamental to the execution of Operation Overlord in 1944 as well. So Bertram Ramsay is top notch,
I think
in my opinion.
On this earlier, how many of these boats were really civilian driven?
Only about 5%. I shouldn't say only 5%. That 5% made a difference for a whole lot of people.
And unlike this, they actually, like a lot of them had Royal Navy crew members.
Correct.
Don't let them, yeah.
And, you know, one of the big points of contention, I suppose, is, well, what qualifies as a tiny ship or a small ship? A cruiser can count as a tiny ship in the broad scheme of things. So, you know, it's not all sailboats and yachts, you know, like it is often reinforced in the popular consciousness of it.
It just showed the Mimosa. Is that a boat?
I believe so,
Yeah.
yes. And I believe, as we go back to Mark Rylance's character here, who's a composite of Charles Lightoller, Charles Lightoller crammed over 100 people on the Sundowner, his vessel, which is afloat to this very day at a maritime museum. Which exact maritime museum is this escapes me, but it is still afloat, and you can see the vessel that brought over 100 men home, which is a really profound thing.
This isn't all of what David Case said, but it's summed up. Less gliding Spitfire scenes and more context would have benefited the film.
We're going to come to the gliding Spitfire when we get to that moment, which is it's coming up fairly shortly.
Did we ever actually find out, or did I just miss this the two times I've seen this movie, how he was stuck out there on that boat and what gave him such PTSD?
Cillian Murphy?
Yes.
So he was on a vessel that had been presumably sunk earlier by a torpedo. He was one of the few survivors. Mark Rylance's character comes across him, fishes him out.
I just didn't know if it was explained why he was just out there on that boat.
Yeah.
I remember thinking that in the movie theater when we saw this.
Oh boy, as we are at the 122 mark here, one of the really terrifying things, that a good detail on the part of the filmmakers is that when they're swimming, you can see that the water is brown, which suggests that there's oil in the water. And so many of these scenes evoke this ticking time bomb sort of sentiment. You have the air battle going on above you. You have the ship sinking. You have oil in the water. You know where this is going. You know that flames are soon to follow and what all that will entail for men who are in the water. And if you go to even the likes of the Wikipedia page or the Wikipedia article on the Dunkirk evacuation, you can see several photographs that look very much like this, of cruisers and the like being sunk, men jumping off of them. It's a great visual representation that we see here in these scenes. Kind of a white knuckle moment as you're watching it all unfold.
Kingman Civic again with the really thought-provoking questions. Movie sacrifices? I think we touched on this earlier. I don't know if this is exactly what you're meaning, but in an effort to have it look as good as possible with practical effects and all that, and shooting it at Dunkirk, well, there was modern facades and things like that.
Yeah, and modern warehouses. And I think one thing that they should have conceded on, they should have used some CGI because there's just not enough boats. The story captures the desperation and the heroics of the hour. It does not capture the scale, though.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the big letdowns of the movie.
CGI gets a bad rap because it's very overdone nowadays. But I mean, use it how it's supposed to be. You know, just as
there
an
are
enhancement.
Great practical ways to use CGI. The Saving Private Ryan once more comes to mind when you see all the LSTs and the barrage balloons and the naval vessels as Captain Miller's squad is leaving the beach, embarking on their mission. That is a responsible way to use.
And Band of Brothers showing the surrendering German
CGI,
column,
yes. There are responsible ways to use CGI for historical films that won't age poorly, and they should have done it more.
Yeah, and again,
movie.
it only works if you can't tell it's CGI, which is why you only use it sparingly so you don't realize.
Yeah, unlike Pearl Harbor.
I mean, look at Jurassic Park in 1993.
Holds up pretty well.
And then look at the Avengers. It looks so stupid. Sorry, I probably offended a bunch of people. Yeah, this is this scale model bomber that they crashed into.
Yeah, we're at the 125 mark. How horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Having to make the choice between either drowning or burning. My God. A horrifying moment.
Jerry, you are correct. The CGI drops and resupply drops in Band of Brothers do look very CGI. The men who were not able to be evacuated became POWs.
Correct.
If they survived.
Yeah, and in fact, 1 out of every 7 men who were at Dunkirk became prisoners of war. So there's a whole other story to that, because those guys, they're POWs for 4 or 5 years. I mean, I can't even begin to fathom being in a stalag or something like that for 4 or 5 years, getting captured here at the outset of this global conflict.
Probably better than being a POW for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and of course, while somewhere in the 25,000 to 35,000 range of French soldiers evacuated after this, the vast majority of them become prisoners. Something else, too, that I'll point out is that 1 out of every 3 people evacuated from the beach during the core evacuation process were French. You really don't get a sense of their story in this either. We also see here at the 120, right before the 127 mark, you see women on some of the vessels as well, on some of the civilian boats too. And to my knowledge, I don't think any women were on the civilian boats. I could be wrong. There's always outliers. Not too common though. Oh, and as we're at the 127 point here, now we see the gliding Spitfire that some of you have mentioned. And I had a moment of disbelief when I saw this in theaters too. I'm like, come on, like really? And then he shoots down a Junkers plane while he's at it too. But just for the benefit of the doubt, a number of RAF pilots said that you could glide a Spitfire as far as 15 miles after you ran out of gas, depending upon the conditions. And additionally, too, the Junkers that we see in these scenes were certainly not as maneuverable as a Spitfire. And a Spitfire could go after them, prey upon them quite handily in the broad scheme of things. And so while it certainly may seem that this gliding Spitfire is a big theatrical liberty, the firsthand accounts of a number of veterans attest that at least it's in the realm of possibility that something like this could happen. Now, whether or not it could land in the sand, like we see here in a little bit, is something else entirely.
So if this was Mythbusters, this is where we'd stamp up the big plausible.
This movie would make for a great Mythbusters episode.
What do you think? Should we do it?
Okay,
so Ulysses says we see Cillian Murphy in the other timeline before he boards the ship. I missed that. Every time I watch this movie, I've never seen that.
It's movies like this where you notice something different every time.
I love movies that don't spoon feed you, and rewatching them every time teaches you something new.
It's true. And Christopher Nolan films, they make you think. You have to pay attention.
It took me like 6 times of watching Inception.
This one's a little bit more clear cut than that.
I first watched that movie on a burned Iraqi DVD that they sold me for $2.
Oh, now you're going to get us some legal problems.
Where did that question go? They're really coming in now. Were there any stories of the left behind soldiers that escaped internment and possibly joined the resistance?
So there's a few different angles that I can go with that. We'll be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but the last pilot, Tom Hardy's character, who we see here, his character is loosely based off of a New Zealand pilot by the name of Al Steer, who presumably landed his plane in a fashion similar to that in the movie. And he had to finagle his way to the front of the queue to try to get back on a boat, to get back to England,
to get back
in a plane, to fly back over the channel, to keep on fighting. It's a hell of a story when you think about it. And when he was trying to get onto a boat, some of the ground troops on the beach were like, "Where the hell have you been?" Much of the aerial combat was either taking place over the channel, and some of the aerial combat was actually taking place several miles inland away from the beach. And that's why a lot of the ground troops on the beach didn't see it. So he was able to escape. He lives to fight another day. Some of the Frenchmen, believe it or not, who make it to England actually end up going back to France after terms are drawn up between Germany and France. So can you imagine that, like surviving Dunkirk and going back to France to live Nazi-occupied country? And that may seem really unusual, but it was their home. That's where their families were. Mm-hmm. They thought terms of some sort of conciliation had been drawn up. And so, yeah, some of them go back to live.
Justin Shope's watching.
Oh, hi, Justin. I'm not sure. I'm sure some of the Frenchmen who returned thereafter became members of the resistance. I'm not sure of any British service members who were left behind, though, and fought as a guerrilla for the next 4 years. I'm not quite as sure about that.
I love this scene where after all this, he takes that off and you're like, oh, he was doing all that.
We're at the 132
He was doing all that in a suit and tie.
Yes. Yes.
Were the POWs, where did they go? The difference between the air crew and the ground troops, were they treated differently by the Germans?
Well, they oftentimes, I know later in the war, they often ended up in different camps.
The pilots were often officers. And they would
go to an officer's prison, sometimes specifically a Stalag prison that would be intended for air officers. And those Stalags, like the ones we often see in the movies, are Hogan's Heroes, not an accurate depiction of Stalag life. If you were an airman, you would be guarded by Luftwaffe guards. And just a fun Easter egg, at the 133 mark here, the blind man that puts his face up or his hand up on the young soldier's face, that is actually Christopher Nolan's dad, making a cameo in the film. At the 133:30 mark, the lone soldier here, finding himself in horror to be the last one on the dock. Did you know any guys like this in the Army? Always the last one.
There's one in every unit.
Yes.
He's usually found right next to the guy that doesn't know how to shower.
The universal truths of military service, regardless of the time.
POW by Douglas Collins is a good book about Canadian captured at Dunkirk.
Great suggestion.
Unless you have some thoughts on the scene, what are your thoughts on the movie Stalag 17? Did you already talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great one.
I've been reading while you're talking. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like a film noir in a POW camp. As we're at the 134 mark, we see the naval commander saying that he's going to stay. He's going to wait for the French. And the sad reality is that for a lot of the French, it was too late. They had really sacrificed themselves to allow the British Expeditionary Force to flee, to live, fight on another day. Now, tens of thousands of French soldiers are evacuated, but sadly, not all of them. As we're at the 135 mark, I enjoy this little subtlety near the end of the film. because we see some children playing trackside. And, at this point, the war seems like a million miles away. Life goes on to an extent with a degree of normality. And Dunkirk survivors, as they were returning to train stations and docks and piers, they said, people were in their finest checkered suits, they were in their finest dresses, and there seemed to be a disconnect between what was happening a mere 50 miles across the channel with how people were still living over in Great Britain. But sure enough, in the coming months, as the Battle of Britain was soon to commence, the harsh realities of the war were no longer to be escaped so easily.
This beach would have been littered.
136 we are.
Would have been littered with equipment and uniforms, rifles.
And I think likewise, too, if you look at all the wet sand, I'm thinking like it would have been like trying to land in cement, and you would have gone, as soon as your wheels would have touched that, it would have gone right into the slush. I'm
no aviator, but I've watched enough YouTube aviators to say potentially it would have been better for him to land with his engine off. Well, his engine is off, with his gear still up.
As we near the 137 mark, we get a sense that the Dunkirk miracle, the Dunkirk myth in some cases even, it was born almost immediately out of the aftermath of all of this. As the movie's tagline would suggest, survival was victory. At this moment, at this time, it was enough. In a tactical sense, Dunkirk is a complete and utter military defeat and failure, strategically speaking. But the idea that you live to fight on another day, there is a sense of victory and accomplishment to be found in that. And it was something that was infused into British propaganda of the time. It was featured in subsequent Hollywood movies. And it allowed Americans in particular to endear themselves to the British even further. And it really suited its purposes in that regard.
Greg, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this. Thibodeau gave us $10 for popcorn
Greg.
fund. He says, well done, boys.
Thank you. Here at the very end of the film, we have the reciting of Winston Churchill's speech defending our island and whatnot. We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them on the landing grounds. We'll fight them in the streets, et cetera, et cetera. This is the stuff that legends are made of. But Churchill delivered that the day after, I believe, these guys got back. And then there's this iconic shot as we near 139.
Of a Spitfire with no engine in it.
Well, you weren't going to burn a real one with the engine in it. But we get our only glimpse of the Germans here, and they're just fuzzy characters in the background. And it adds to this sort of mystique, this air of mystery that the enemy is lingering out there, but you never really see them. Mm-hmm. It works somewhat brilliantly from a cinematic standpoint. Nolan anticipated on having this shot at 139, the burning Spitfire, being the very last shot of the film. But instead, he goes back to the young soldier because the forthcoming fight is going to be placed on his shoulders, and it speaks of the war yet to be fought and the war yet to be won. And so we see not the burning wreckage at the end, but we see the face of youth, the face of the combatant here at the very end. And I think it's a very evocative in that regard.
Instead, Tom Hardy's going to be sitting in solitary bouncing a baseball.
With the cooler king. Yes, absolutely.
There is a praise about the Germans continuously counterattacking right after defeats, but the British, in a larger sense, are better at this. They did win.
And something else too, a complexity that I forgot to mention a little bit earlier. There was conversation of the German tanks stopping. We were engaged in another conversation at the time, and there's a lot of speculation as to how and why that happens in the way that it does. There's 2 or 3 main reasons. One of which, the terrain is really boggy. It's not very hospitable for tanks maneuvering. There was also the problem of maintenance. They were trying to do maintenance on the German tanks. They had been, going all for bear in their pursuit of the Allied forces. They needed to take a little bit of a breather. And additionally, too, the German armor was far out in advance of the German infantry columns that were behind them, and they didn't want to jump pell-mell into a full-out assault on the Dunkirk vicinity without infantry supporting them. And so those are 3 main factors as to why the Germans didn't just sweep in and brush up the whole contingent in one fatal blow.
If you look at the news recently, you'll find out why you don't attack with tanks without infantry support.
Yes, Ukraine, anyone? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was going to suggest we, get into a little bull session about what caused Dunkirk, anything, the aftermath of it, any anecdotes we have?
Well, yeah, as I said, in the months afterward, we see the Battle of Britain take flight. And this is perhaps an even more definitive moment, I think, in British military history. When Christopher Nolan was making this film, when he was doing interviews on the subject, he defined Dunkirk as a turning point not only in World War II history, but in human history. There are these moments of fate on which the future hinges. And in Nolan's mind, Dunkirk was one of those moments. Not because it was an astounding military success, but as I alluded to earlier, it was because it bought time. And sometimes all that you need for success in the long run is time. And time is a theme of almost all of his movies. It can be found, it's replete in all of his cinematic features. And so I really like the historical angle of it in this one, though.
Another $4.99 for our popcorn fund from Why Too Low. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Every little bit helps.
Like I said, I turned off monetization for this just so that you could just follow along, no ads, all that. This does occasionally add up. Jared just yesterday drove to Pittsburgh and gave a real history talk for a crowd there.
Yeah, if you run a museum, a library, something like that.
I know anyone who does.
Yeah, I do give lectures and presentations on how history is portrayed through the lens of Hollywood. So I'm not as unreachable as you may think.
I mean, he hangs out with somebody like me, so. Well, is there any news on the next live stream?
This was our first formal one. Yeah. We did a test the other night, as some of you may have seen.
I like to stay engaged, and I said, we're about 25,000 subscribers. Let's give them something special. How about a live stream?
Yeah.
And it turns out it's much more engaging than I anticipated. Maybe this is something we'll do more often.
Yeah, we may save it for benchmark moments in the evolution of our channel, but we really enjoy talking with you all and engaging in these sorts of one-on-one conversations. And so I think we can definitely assume that there are more of these on the way.
If Dunkirk failed, we in Britain were probably doomed. Yeah. Well,
it's in the realm of possibility.
They would have had to train an entire army.
Yeah, and the British Isles have a wonderful moat in the form of an English channel that makes it very difficult for invaders throughout history. So you had that going for you. Any other questions or comments before we wrap things up?
I was pretty tentative to this as we were going through. I might have missed one. If anyone has any questions for us, go ahead and toss them out right now.
Yeah.
I know
You can also leave comments even after this video is done being live. And of course, you can also email us as well. You can also send us a message through our Facebook page, Real History. If you haven't liked our Facebook page, please do so. I also run my own Facebook page talking about some of my historical pursuits, and that page is Historian Jared Frederick on Facebook. So we welcome you to check us out through those social media platforms as well.
Thomas Mills, go ahead and email us, realhistory1944@gmail.com. He has a lot of information about his father, who was a forward observer in the war. David Kay, you were his tour guide in Gettysburg.
Oh, wonderful. And I'm always glad to run into people who I've given tours to.
We just did that last weekend. We were driving a 1944 Willys MB around the Gettysburg battlefield in World War II uniforms. It was fantastic.
Yep.
This was great. Thanks, gents. Perfect for a lazy Sunday.
You are welcome.
Is there a war movie story that hasn't been made that you would like to see made?
Oh, man. I'm really partial to Gettysburg, of course. And even though Gettysburg is this 4-hour epic, there's a lot of elements that it doesn't cover. I think a movie about the wheat field at Gettysburg. There's as many casualties in that 13-acre field of wheat as all Americans' casualties suffered on D-Day. So it's an incredibly powerful thing. I could probably make a whole list of hypothetical historical films that I'd like to see made into movies.
Overlord 1944, is there any part of World War II that you feel is under/not represented on film that should be?
The China-Burma-India theater.
I was literally going to say the same thing.
I don't think there's been a movie about the China-Burma-India theater since the 1960s. An incredibly important theater of operation. You could do a film about pilots flying the hump over the Himalayas. You could do a movie about Merrill's Marauders. And of course, the British play an even more substantial part in the China-Burma-India theater. That is definitely something that is underrepresented in World War II cinema. I'd love to see something like that.
David wants a movie on Culp's Hill.
Oh, a movie on Culp's Hill. I think Christopher Nolan could do a movie on Culp's Hill and Cemetery. And once again, that idea of time. Because after all, what is a battle other than action and reaction? I'd love for Christopher Nolan to make a Civil War movie. Dale Dye could be the technical advisor for it. I love it.
Still waiting for the Pegasus Bridge movie.
I know. That's been lingering forever. I'd love to see the Pegasus Bridge film.
I'd like to do this one as another live stream sometime, Ford versus Ferrari.
Oh, yes.
I had planned to sit in on that one. I can't stand editing myself. And the beautiful thing about doing this is I don't have to.
Okay, so I think we have our answer. Our next live stream will be Ford versus Ferrari, and you will get to hear the insight of Andy's inner mechanic.
Yep, I'm a vehicle fan. We have a local Shelby shop here in town, and I actually have a picture of me next to the prop vehicle that they used for that, the elongated version.
There we go. Shall we start to wrap things up?
Yeah, let's wrap things. Well, still got some stuff coming in. Great stream, loved it. What would be your favorite World War I movie? My favorite World War I movie, boy. There's a very humble World War I movie that I am partial to, and that is Journey's End. It has Asa Butterfield, and it has Paul Bettany in it. And, it shows the exploits of a single company in the British Army during World War I. And it's a very effective anti-war film. There's very much a sense that we aren't escaping this, what's coming, that I think is a very accurate reflection of the psyche of World War I soldiers. So if you haven't seen it, Journey's End is a really good World War I film in that regard. Jerry says, wear red and blue shirts to keep up the car, the competitive car theme. I think we're way ahead of you. We just have to not change. Yeah. Or maybe it's Republican, Democrat. I don't know. Thoughts on the Ken Burns war documentaries? What's your favorite? Oh, boy.
I'm a big fan of Ken Burns. Of course, his Civil War film is groundbreaking. It lays the template. What's that?
I said it's not Flyboys.
Yeah. His World War II one is really special because I think it's very unique how he examined the war through the lens of 4 American towns and the people who participated in it. Of course, it's only told through the American perspective, his World War II film. I would have to say his best film is his Vietnam War film because I think it goes to a darker and more complex place than any of his previous films. There's a sense of empathy to it. And that empathy comes from the fact that he interviews people from both sides. He shows both sides of the war. You really get perspective on what motivated people of both sides to fight in the Vietnam War. And it makes us confront some uncomfortable truths and hard realities, which I think is always healthy for society to do. And so I have to say, I don't know if it's my favorite of Ken Burns' films, but it's his best from a scholarly point of view.
All right, I'll read these last 2 comments and then we'll do our little wrap up. I would love to see a Band of Brothers type series for something from the Civil War.
Oh, and I got it too. And I actually spoke with my old boss at Gettysburg about this, Scott Hartwig, who's an esteemed Civil War historian. And he actually wrote up a treatment, an outline for a Civil War miniseries about the Iron Brigade.
Oh, okay.
Crack troops who were from Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, kind of these rugged frontiersmen, farmer types. And they were everywhere through the first half of the war, and they get chewed up throughout. And there's a lot of parallels between their journey and Easy Company's journey in my mind that would make a phenomenal series. So I would love to see a Civil War miniseries on the Iron Brigade. I would also like to see, I'm not a big fan of sequels, I would love to see a sequel to the movie Glory, because at the end of Glory, spoiler alert, mute now if you haven't seen it, you get the impression that most of these guys die and that's the end of their regiment, but that they were only halfway through the war and they fought in many, many more battles. And if that were to ever come to fruition, you could call it Beyond Glory. I think that would work really well. One more?
Lots of people saying they love Band of Brothers styles.
Yeah, it's a formula that really works.
Would be kind of interesting to see your thoughts on a game called Hell Let Loose, specifically the maps and a little bit of the gameplay. I actually have Hell Let Loose.
And some of our friends play it very religiously.
One of our friends streams it on Twitch. I don't know how often, but I can try and set something up, provide links if you email.
Yeah, from what I've seen, I'm impressed with some of the research that those designers, they really look at the terrain, the buildings, the settings, the vehicles, the weapons, the tanks. So from what I've seen, I'm pretty impressed with the likes of Hell Let Loose from a historical standpoint.
All except for the fact that you can take a bandage and wrap it around your arm and you're good to go again.
Well, that's video games for you.
Look up Fanatic Duck on Twitch. You'll get to see all his stuff. All right, so I can't keep going at this all day. I mean, I'd love to, but I can't.
Yep.
Somebody's watching my kids right now. So.
We thank you so much for tuning into our inaugural live stream and historical breakdown of a motion picture. Dunkirk is a very powerful film, despite some of its historical condensing and slight flaws throughout, because all in all, it shows us how tense and desperate the state of affairs were from a military perspective in the spring of 1940. And I think that this film serves as a unique cinematic benchmark in the realm, in the canon of war films. And I think it's just as revolutionary as Saving Private Ryan or 1917, even though it is comparatively bloodless in contrast to those films. And one of Christopher Nolan's hopes from this film, he said, I take full credit for condensing characters and condensing things and ideas. But in the end, he said that he hoped people would pick up a history book, learn the true life story about the true life individuals, And I'd say if filmmakers walk out of their productions with those hopes, then hopefully in the end they're somewhat successful.
And you've said the
as a
same thing
result.
several times.
Yes.
If a movie can start a conversation and have somebody pick up a book, then it did its job.
And on that note, we really enjoyed having this conversation with all of you. It won't be our last. So until next time.
I have some technical things to talk about. Because just like Payush Arya is sad they missed it all. They just got on here. Don't worry. These stay on the channel. You won't see them in our regular list of videos, but I have a playlist for our live videos. There are 2 of them now. I deleted the accidental 1.5 minute one earlier, but
and we offer timestamps throughout. As long as you start the movie at the same time that we start the movie in the recording that you'll find on our channel, and you'll be able to watch this anytime that you want to. So and no fears.
Just like Joe Simmons is alluding to here, don't be afraid to just listen to our videos. If you've seen the movie before, you can kind of hear the scene whenever I put it in. Sorry, they're so short, but
our videos make for good podcast during your commute to work.
I have YouTube Premium, so I can shut my screen off and just let it go. But so all of these that we do will continue to be in our library. Be sure to check out our Patreon. There's a couple special perks on there. I'm still fine-tuning it. I put out a Q&A on there for our mid-level donors, and nobody asked any questions. So we'll see how that goes. I might modify things a little bit. Go to realhistoryfilms.com and check out all our information there, our educational resources, our T-shirts, our forthcoming upcoming projects. And if you'd like to see some of our other extracurricular work, you can check out, furiousforth.org? Yep. Furiousforth.org is our World War II reenacting page. We go to events all over the Northeast of the United States, and we'll be at Conneaut D-Day, Ohio in August. Come say hi. Yeah, and I will have a table there signing my books. And so if you find yourself at that big World War II reenactment, come on by and say hello. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm going to end this stream now and make sure everything's kosher on the video staying around. And until next time. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. Hang tough. And go check out Recon Jack.